My mother left my daughter a single $1 bill right after she secretly drained the girl's entire 3-year savings of $6,900 to pay for my sister's wedding flowers. She said, "Maya is young, she has plenty of time to make it back." But Agnes's wedding has to be perfect. What she didn't know was that she just wiped out the $45,000 her favorite daughter was supposed to receive. The Santa Ana winds were blowing through Newport Beach that afternoon, a dry, irritable heat that made the palm fronds hiss like nesting snakes. In Orange County, the heat doesn't make you sluggish, it makes you brittle. It's an arid, electric kind of tension that crawls under your skin and stays there. Inside our home, the air conditioning hummed with a low hum, trying to keep the 100 degrees Fahrenheit desert air at bay. I was in the kitchen, slowly working through a Blue Magic smoothie, when the silence of the house was punctuated by a sharp, hollow thud. I looked up to see Maya. My 17-year-old daughter stood in the hallway, her face a mask of pale shock that made the freckles on her nose stand out like ink splatters. In her hands, she clutched a heavy glass canister, a designer apothecary jar she'd repurposed, adorned with a single sticker, "Future Marine Biologist, Australia Fund." The jar was chillingly empty. No, not entirely empty. Sitting at the very bottom, looking microscopic against the thick glass floor, was a single $1 bill. It had been meticulously folded into the shape of a butterfly. "Mom?" Maya's voice was barely a whisper, thin and cracking like parched earth. "It's gone. All of it. I was going to clear the balance for the Great Barrier Reef program today. It was supposed to be done, Mom. All of it." I felt a sudden, sharp drop in my chest, the kind of sensation you get when you realize a load-bearing beam has just snapped. I knew that butterfly. It was a signature, a whimsical, patronizing little habit my mother, Vanessa, had used since I was a child. She called them butterfly kisses, usually given to us when she was feeling particularly generous with her pocket change. To see it here, at the bottom of my daughter's stolen future, was a declaration of war. To understand why my heart felt like it was being ground into the porcelain floor, you have to understand Maya's grind. In a town where most kids her age spent their summers lounging on private docks or posting curated, candid shots from the Waldorf Astoria, Maya had chosen the dirt. For 3 years, she had built a pet-sitting and dog-walking empire in the steep, winding hills of Newport Coast and Laguna Beach. I had watched her come home every evening, her sneakers ruined by trail dust, her shirt salt-crusted from the sweat of walking 3 golden doodles at a time in the relentless California sun. She had worked through the holidays, waking up at 5 a.m. on Christmas Day to feed horses in the canyons, while my sister, Agnes, and my mother lounged in silk pajamas, sipping mimosas and complaining about the lack of service at the local country club. I could have easily funded Maya's internship. As an architect specializing in high-end coastal residential, my bank account was more than healthy. But after my divorce 10 years ago, after my ex-husband had systematically stripped away my confidence and my assets, I wanted Maya to know the weight of her own agency. I wanted her to know that her dreams were built on a foundation of her own making, one that no man or circumstance could ever pull out from under her. And now, my mother had treated that foundation like a slush fund. Maya used to greet her grandmother's visits with such fervor, pouring out her dreams and plans with a trusting heart. Vanessa would offer her smiles and polished praise, occasionally playing the doting benefactor by tucking a $5 bill into the glass jar. It was a cold, calculated betrayal. The very person who had helped build that small reservoir of hope was the one who eventually reached in to drain it dry. The rage that sparked in me wasn't the hot, messy kind. It was cold. I remembered Vanessa's comments from dinner last week. She had been lamenting the rising costs of Agnes's boho chic wedding at Pelican Hill. "The white orchids are double the price this season, Cassandra." She had sighed, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. "Agnes is just devastated. She needs that floral arch for the ceremony photos. Her Instagram followers expect a certain aesthetic, you know? Family really should step up when things are this critical." I had ignored her then, thinking it was just more of her usual narcissistic chatter. "Get in the car, Maya," I said. My voice was low, vibrating with a frequency I hadn't used in a decade. "Mom, what are we doing?" "We're going to Newport Coast," I said, grabbing my keys. "And we're going to find out exactly how much those flowers were worth to your grandmother." As we walked out into the shimmering, oppressive heat of the Santa Ana winds, I felt a total shift in my internal architecture. For years, I had been the reliable one. I had been the daughter who designed Vanessa's home renovations for free, the one who covered the gaps in her lifestyle expenses, the one who stayed silent to keep the peace. But as I looked at the empty jar Maya was still holding, the submissiveness I'd carried since the divorce evaporated. What she didn't know was that she had just committed a $45,000 mistake. That was the amount I had quietly earmarked as a wedding gift for Agnes, a gesture to settle her catering bills and give her a fresh start. I started the engine. The high-performance hum of the SUV felt like a growl. The origami butterfly sat at the bottom of a glass jar behind the passenger seat, where I had carefully placed it inside a small cardboard box at once, a cruel taunt and a quiet heartbreak. The drive to Newport Coast was a study in rising temperatures and falling patience. The SUV's tires hummed against the pristine asphalt of Pacific Coast Highway, the ocean to our right, a mocking, glittering blue. Beside me, Maya was a statue of quiet grief, her hands folded in her lap as if she were afraid to touch anything and find it empty. In the world of architecture, we call it structural fatigue, the point where a material has been stressed so many times, it simply forgets how to hold itself up. Vanessa's house sat behind a gate within a gate, a Mediterranean-style monolith overlooking the Pacific. As we stepped out, the Santa Ana winds whipped a stray strand of hair across my face like a lash. But the moment the heavy mahogany doors swung open, we were enveloped in the Newport chill, a hospital-grade HVAC system that smelled faintly of expensive eucalyptus diffusers and a complete lack of soul. "Cassie!" And Maya, "Look at you, you're glowing, though perhaps a bit wind-blown," Vanessa greeted us, gliding across the white marble foyer. She looked curated, her skin pulled tight by the best surgeons in the county, her linen lounge set the exact color of an unblemished pearl. She reached out to touch Maya's cheek, but my daughter flinched, retreating into the shadow of my shoulder. "We're not staying for the pleasantries, Mom," I said, my voice hitting the marble like a dropped chisel. I held up the glass canister. The sun hitting the foyer made the single-folded butterfly at the bottom glow with a sickeningly bright light. "Where is Maya's money?" Vanessa's smile didn't break. It merely pivoted into that disappointed matriarch expression she had perfected over decades. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, a masterpiece of Calacatta marble and hidden appliances. "Honestly, Cassandra, you've always had such a transactional view of relationships," she said, her back to us as she poured 3 glasses of alkaline water. "Family isn't a balance sheet, it's a support system. And right now, your sister is in a crisis." Agnes wandered in from the terrace, her phone practically fused to her palm. She was wearing an oversized bride sweatshirt and biker shorts, her hair in a messy bun that probably took 40 minutes to achieve. "Mom, did the florist call back?" Agnes asked, ignoring us entirely. "If I don't get the white orchids for the Pelican Hill reception, the whole coastal boho aesthetic is dead. My photographer said the lighting at the resort requires editorial-grade florals, or the shots will look flat, and Thatcher is being so weird about the budget. He says he won't pay for perishable decor." I looked at my sister, a woman who measured her worth in engagement metrics and the approval of a man who treated her like a line-item expense. Then I looked back at Vanessa, who was handing a glass of water to Agnes with a look of pure, enabling devotion. "I simply reallocated some funds for the family's immediate needs, Cassandra," Vanessa said, her voice devoid of even a hint of shame. "And before you start a scene, remember that Maya is 17. She has her whole life to save for a trip. But Agnes, this is her moment. She's building a brand, a life. She can't walk down the aisle looking mid-tier." "Mid-tier?" I whispered. The word felt like a slap. Maya worked 5 a.m. shifts on Christmas. She walked dogs until her feet bled in the Laguna Hills while you two were getting oxygen facials. That wasn't family money, Mom. That was her life's blood. "She can work more shifts," Agnes chimed in,
scrolling through a digital lookbook. It's just dog walking, Cassie. It's not like she's performing surgery. Besides, she can go to Australia after she finishes college. What's the rush? The invisibility Maya had endured for years finally became a physical weight in the room. I saw my daughter shrink, her eyes fixed on the floor, her spirit being dismantled by the very people who were supposed to protect it. I felt the final structural tie to my mother snap. It wasn't a loud break. It was the silent, terrifying moment a dam gives way. "You're right, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, rhythmic calm. Image is everything in Newport, isn't it? And family should support each other. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My thumb hovered over my banking app. I had been setting aside the profits from my high-end residential projects. A $45,000 gift for Agnes's wedding was a gesture to settle her catering bills and prove that, despite our differences, I was the good sister. Or perhaps, it was simply the ingrained habit of knowing that, sooner or later, I would inevitably be the one covering a portion of my mother's credit card debt anyway. I opened the app and turned the screen toward them. The balance glowed in the dim, expensive light of the kitchen. $45,000. Vanessa's eyes went wide. A soft, hungry gasp escaped her lips. "Cassie, oh, thank God, this settles everything. We can call the caterer at the Ritz, and the floral arch we can double the size." Agnes dropped her phone on the counter, her eyes lighting up with a predatory, sudden affection. "Oh, Cassie, I can finally get the custom silk draping for the ballroom." I looked at Maya. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. She wasn't looking at the money, she was looking at me, waiting to see if I would fold again. If I would prioritize the family peace over the girl who had actually earned her keep. "You're right, Mom," I said, my voice cold as a Pacific riptide. "Family does come first." With 3 steady taps, I initiated a transfer. I didn't send it to the Ritz. I didn't send it to the orchid importer. I transferred the full cost of the Australian internship, plus an extra $5,000 for travel and gear, directly into Maya's college savings account. Transfer successful. "What are you doing?" Agnes asked, her voice rising to a shrill, frantic pitch as she watched my face. "I'm reallocating the budget," I said, tucking the phone back into my pocket. "Maya's future just got fully funded, and as for your wedding gift, Agnes, that $45,000 wasn't just a gift, it was the deposit for the ballroom at Pelican Hill. Without it, your coastal boho dream is just a Pinterest board."
Vanessa stood frozen, the glass of alkaline water trembling in her hand. As the silence in the room became a vacuum, the sound of an entire high society future collapsing under the weight of a single, honest debt. A vacuum created by the sudden withdrawal of $45,000 from the family's expectations. In an architect's world, when a cantilevered structure loses its support, there is a terrifying moment of stillness before the entire thing yields to gravity. I watched the realization sink into my mother's face, not a realization of guilt, but the cold, hard math of a tactical error. Vanessa's hand trembled slightly as she set her glass of alkaline water on the marble. The Newport chill in the air seemed to sharpen. "Cassandra," she began, her voice dropping into that melodic, manipulative register she used when she wanted to negotiate a change order. She stepped toward me, her heels clicking like a countdown. "You've made your point, you've protected Maya, but let's be rational. That $45,000. You said it was for the wedding. You can't just take it back because of a temporary disagreement over a few $1,000s. "It wasn't a disagreement, Mom. It was a theft," I said. I looked at Agnes, who was staring at the floor, her mind clearly frantically scrolling through her mental budget. "Cassie, come on." Agnes snapped, her boho chic facade finally cracking to reveal the entitled child underneath. "You know Thatcher isn't paying for the catering at Pelican Hill. He thinks a buffet at a country club is fine. If you don't put down that deposit, I lose the date. I lose the ballroom. My entire branding for the next 6 months is tied to this wedding. Do you have any idea what this does to my engagement?" I looked at my sister, a woman who measured her life in pixels and likes, and felt a profound sense of exhaustion. "I know exactly what it does, Agnes. I had an appointment with Beatrice at Saffron and Silk for 4 o'clock this afternoon. I was going to hand her the check. A gift. to ensure you had your A-list moment. Agnes's eyes lit up with a desperate, predatory hope. So you're still going? We can just go now. I'll even apologize to Maya. Maya, I'm sorry, okay? There. Now Cassie, we have to hurry or we'll lose the slot. The lack of sincerity in her voice was a structural flaw I could no longer ignore. I'm not going to the appointment, Agnes, I said. I pulled out my phone and hit the speed dial for the catering director. I pressed the speakerphone icon and set the device on the marble island. The ringtone echoed through the silent, sterile kitchen. Saffron and Silk, Beatrice speaking. A crisp, professional voice chirped. Hello, Cassandra. We're all set for the 4 o'clock. Are you on your way? Agnes leaned forward, her breath hitching. Vanessa was frozen, her face a mask of dawning horror. Beatrice, it's Cassandra Vance, I said, my voice as steady as a plumb line. I'm calling to cancel the appointment. I will not be providing the $45,000 deposit for my sister's wedding. The silence on the other end of the line was mirrored in the room. I'm sorry? Beatrice asked, her professional veneer slipping. Cancel? Cassandra, if we don't have the deposit by 5, the Pelican Hill date opens up to the waitlist. There are 3 other brides vying for that weekend. Let them have it, I said, locking eyes with my mother. The funding for this project has been pulled, due to a catastrophic failure in leadership. Thank you, Beatrice. I ended the call. For 3 seconds, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Then, the collapse began. Agnes screamed a jagged, ugly sound that tore through the curated peace of the Newport house. You've always been small-minded, Cassie. You're ruining a legacy for a dog walker's pocket change. I'll be the laughingstock of the OC. Everyone knows I booked Pelican Hill. Vanessa turned pale, the blood retreating from her Botox-tightened skin until she looked like a ghost of herself. She realized, too late, that she had traded a $45,000 fortress for a $6,000 heist. Cassie, wait, Vanessa stammered, her voice shaking. She started backpedaling, her sweet mask finally shattered. I'll pay Maya. I'll find the money. I'll sell the Cartier watch your father gave me. Just call Beatrice back. Tell her it was a misunderstanding. We can't lose the ballroom. Too late, Mom, I said. The loathing I felt was pure, a cold jet of ice in my veins. The foundation is gone. You can't build a high society wedding on a theft. Maya, let's go. I turned and walked out, not looking back at the sobbing bride or the ghost-white matriarch. The dry Santa Ana wind hit me like a physical wall. I climbed into the SUV and pulled my phone back out. I opened the security app to review the morning's footage, and there she was, my mother, arriving at 10 a.m. I'd been buried in blueprints in my home office at the time, buzzing her in remotely with the weary assumption that she'd only come to nag about the wedding preparations. By the time I finished and headed downstairs, she had already vanished. The phone vibrated against my palm. A message from Vanessa. You're misunderstanding. I was only borrowing from Maya for the flower deposit. I was going to pay it back soon. There it was. That was all I needed. I had the evidence, and I had the lawyers. I drafted a swift email before shifting the car into gear. To Cole Morgan. Cole, I need the sharpest, coldest version of you. My mother stole nearly $7K from my daughter's room. I have the footage and the confession. I want it back with interest. Handle it. I glanced at Maya. She looked at me, and for the first time in years, the shadow of submissiveness in her eyes had been replaced by a sharp, clear recognition. She wasn't just my daughter anymore. She was an apprentice in the art of the no. As we drove down the coast, the sun was a blinding orange coin sinking into the Pacific, a final payment on a debt Vanessa didn't even realize she owed. The notifications on my phone were like a series of microquakes, each vibration a tiny fracture attempting to spread through the new foundation I was pouring. In the sterile, air-conditioned quiet of my home office, the sound was deafening. I didn't have to look at the screen to know the source. In Orange County, social suicide is considered a fate worse than death, and my mother was currently frantically trying to resuscitate her reputation. Vanessa's texts were a masterclass in high-end gaslighting. Cassandra, you've clearly had a heat-induced breakdown. I was literally in the middle of drafting a repayment schedule for Maya when you stormed out like a child. How could you humiliate your sister in front of Saffron and Silk? You're destroying this family's standing over a temporary cash flow issue. Then came the shift to the martyr of Newport tone. I suppose I'll just have to liquidate my vintage Chanel collection to fix the mess you've made. I hope you're happy knowing your mother is selling her legacy because you decided to be vindictive." I didn't reply. In my line of work, you don't argue with a collapsing wall, you clear the area and call in the demolition crew. I took screenshots of every message, the veiled threats, the blatant lies about promissory notes, the frantic bargaining, and forwarded them in a single clean file to Cole Morgan. Then, I did what I should have done the day I signed my divorce papers. I blocked them, both of them. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was the weight of a vault door finally locking into place. By evening, the theater had moved to a larger stage. Agnes, a woman who treated her Instagram feed like a holy scripture, had launched her counter-offensive. She posted a photo of herself, sitting on the beach in Laguna, looking wistfully at the sunset through a grainy, black and white filter. The caption was a masterpiece of vague booking. "It's heartbreaking when the people you've looked up to your whole life choose a bank balance over blood. Some people would rather see a sister's dreams turn to ash than show a shred of grace. Praying for those who have lost their way in the pursuit of justice. Family first. Heartbroken. Betrayal." The irony was thick enough to choke on. Within 2 hours, the concerned pings started coming in from our extended circle, the women at the yacht club, the developers I worked with, the cousins in San Diego. But the tide didn't turn the way Agnes expected. Most of our circle had spent years enduring her performative main character energy and my mother's subtle cutting elitism. They knew Agnes's boho chic lifestyle was a flimsy facade built on credit and my quiet labor. The lack of public support for her post felt less like a snub and more like an audience settling in to watch a long overdue demolition. The hardest part wasn't the digital noise, it was the silence in the kitchen. I watched Maya sitting at the island, her laptop open to the Great Barrier Reef internship portal, but her eyes were fixed on the empty glass jar. "She used to call me her little pearl," Maya said softly, her voice devoid of its usual spark. "Every time I dived into the pool, or brought home a science trophy, she'd tell me I was the family's sole appreciating asset. I thought she was admiring my growth, but she was just appraising me for future collateral." The pain in her voice was a structural flaw I couldn't simply patch with a wire transfer, but as the night wore on, I saw the shift. Maya watched me coordinate with Cole, her eyes tracking the steady, unemotional way I handled the fallout. "We aren't victims, Maya," I told her, sitting down across from her and closing her laptop. "We are the architects of our own boundaries. If the people inside the house are trying to burn it down, you don't stay and try to save the furniture. You walk out and let the insurance handle the rest." She looked at her phone. Agnes was now posting budget-friendly mood boards to garner sympathy likes, and then she looked at me. She sat up a little straighter, the slumped shoulders of the girl who had been robbed, replaced by the sharp, defensive lines of a woman learning how to hold her ground. The Santa Ana winds were still howling through the canyons of Orange County on Friday, the kind of devil winds that make the brush brittle and the people even more so. In this heat, the sky is a flat, bruised blue, and the air smells faintly of sage and distant wildfires. I sat in my home office, watching the dust motes dance in a sliver of sunlight. When Maya walked in, she looked like a different person than the girl who had collapsed in the hallway. Her face was flushed, her hair pulled back in a utilitarian knot, and her skin was dusted with the fine silt of the Laguna hiking trails. But her eyes were cold as the Pacific at dawn. "She was waiting for me at the trailhead," Maya said, dropping her hydration pack on the floor. She was leaning against her Lexus, looking like she'd stepped out of a Street John catalog, silk scarf, oversized sunglasses, not a hair out of place despite the wind. "My mother, Vanessa, never did anything without an audience, even if that audience was just her own ego. She tried to hug me," Maya continued, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. She smelled like Joe Malone in desperation. She started crying, the kind of quiet, elegant weeping she does at charity galas. "She told me I was her little pearl, and that I had to talk to you. She said I was the only one who could reason with your sudden cruelty before the lawyers destroyed our family's legacy." "And?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Maya reached into the pocket of her leggings. She pulled out the $1 bill Vanessa had left in the jar, the one folded into a butterfly. It was wilted now, the edges frayed from being carried in a pocket through a heat wave. I gave it back to her, Maya said. A small, hard smile touched her lips, a mirror of my own. I told her, "Grandma, you're right. I'm 17, I'm young, I have all the time in the world to make another $6,900. But you're 73, Vanessa. You're old, and you don't have enough time left to earn back a granddaughter who actually loved you." The silence that followed was the sound of a final curtain falling. I looked at my daughter and saw a woman who had just finished building her own fortress. She didn't say anything after that. Maya finished. She just stood there in the dust. I think she realized her white silk scarf was starting to turn cream. "Go get some water, baby," I said, my voice thick. "I have a guest coming over. I need you to stay at Sarah's house for a few hours. I don't want you here for the demolition." The guest arrived at 5 p.m. Vanessa entered my house with a sigh of fake grace, clutching a small boutique bag from the La Durée. "Cassie, dear," she said, her voice a practiced lilt as she walked into the kitchen. "I brought those organic lavender macarons you used to love. I know we've all been stressed. But we're family. We shouldn't let men like Cole Morgan tell us how to treat one another. It's so gauche." She set the macarons on the marble island. The smell, sweet, floral, and entirely artificial, was a ghost of a childhood she had used as a leash for 40 years. I didn't touch the bag. I didn't offer her an iced tea. I didn't even sit down. "Sit down, Mom," I said. She blinked, her sweet mask flickering for a second. She sat, smoothing her linen trousers with trembling fingers. "I know Agnes was out of line on Instagram, and I've told her to delete the posts. We just need to call off the lawyers." "It's embarrassing, Cassie. People at the yacht club are starting to ask questions." "People should ask questions," I said. I slid my iPad Pro across the countertop. On the screen was a thumbnail of a video file. I tapped play. The footage was high definition. It showed my living room. Vanessa was seen entering through the door. The camera caught her walking straight to Maya's room. Vanessa's face went ghostly white, the Botox-tightened skin around her mouth twitching. The Grand Dame of Newport vanished, replaced by a woman staring at the high-res evidence of her own felony. "I have the footage," I said, my voice flat and rhythmic, like a hammer hitting a nail. "And I have the messages where you admitted to taking the loan, only if I funded the Pelican Hill deposit." "In legal terms, Mom, that's not a misunderstanding. That's grand larceny, breaking and entering, and extortion." You wouldn't do this," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "To your own mother? Over a few $1,000s? Think of the scandal, Cassandra. Think of what it would do to your firm's reputation with the city council." "I am thinking of my reputation," I replied. "My reputation is built on integrity, and our relationship is a structure with a condemned foundation. You have two choices. 1. You pay Maya back the full $6,900, plus 15% interest, for the emotional distress you caused, plus every cent of Cole Morgan's legal fees. Right now, wire transfer." I leaned in, the cool air of the kitchen feeling like ice against my skin. Choice 2. I hand this footage, and the text logs to the district attorney. "I hear the Orange County Jail in Santa Ana is particularly lovely in a heat wave when the cooling systems fail. And I imagine your friends at the Philharmonic Society will be fascinated to learn why you're suddenly absent from the gala season." Cole's intel was undeniably effective. His visceral description of the prison conditions was enough to instill a primal sort of dread. Still, we had agreed to draw the line there. Whatever her sins, she was still Maya's grandmother, a woman whose years were already weighing heavy on her. Maya's faith in her had withered to nothing. Yet the girl had no stomach for true cruelty. She didn't want to see her grandmother broken by the weight of the law. Vanessa looked at the iPad, then back at me. She looked for the good daughter she had spent decades training. She didn't find her. "You've changed," she whispered, a sneer finally breaking through her vanity. "You're cold. You're just like your father was before he left for Seattle." "No, Mom," I said, checking my watch. "I'm an architect. I've just finally learned how to read the blueprints of a toxic site. You have 10 minutes to make the transfer. After that, I call the police." I walked to the window and watched the palm trees whip in the wind. Behind me, I heard the frantic, shaking taps of a woman who had finally realized that her favorite daughter's social media metrics weren't worth the price of her own freedom. The soft chime of a banking notification. Vanessa left without a word, her shattered, trembling silhouette, a far cry from the woman who had lived in my mind for so long. The lavender macarons sat untouched on the marble, a sweet, crumbling bribe that had arrived far too late to save a house that had already been leveled to the ground. The Tom Bradley International Terminal at LAX is a temple of glass and steel, a place where the frantic energy of Southern California finally hits a hard boundary. Standing near the security entrance, I watched Maya. She didn't look like the girl who had collapsed in my kitchen a month ago. She looked like someone who had survived a structural failure and walked out with the blueprints for a much larger life. She adjusted the straps of her heavy-duty backpack, the kind meant for the rugged coastal work of the Great Barrier Reef. She had received every cent of the $6,900, plus the 15% interest my mother had practically bled onto the keyboard to transfer. "I'm ready, Mom," Maya said. Her eyes were steady, the sadness of the betrayal now just a weathered patina on her character, rather than a fresh, bleeding wound. She hugged me tight, a firm, grounding embrace that felt like reinforced steel. "Go save the oceans. I'll be right here, building the base camp for whenever you come back." I watched her walk through the metal detector, her silhouette disappearing into the stream of travelers heading toward the Pacific. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel the phantom weight of my mother's expectations or my sister's manufactured crises. I had shed my lifelong submissiveness, like a skin that no longer fit. I was no longer the woman who built luxury facades for others. I had finally built a fortress for myself. I walked out of the terminal and drove south, back toward Newport. I didn't go home. I went to my new office, a space I had designed with high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked straight out at the ocean. I pulled over at a small cafe in Crystal Cove and ordered an espresso, the bitter steam a sharp contrast to the salty sea air. I pulled out my phone not to check for the calls, but to see the public wreckage of the boho chic wedding. Agnes's Instagram was a ghost town. She had archived every single post related to Pelican Hill. A mutual acquaintance had posted a grainy photo of the ceremony from the day before. There were no white orchid arches, no custom silk draping, no high-end catering from Saffron and Silk. Instead, the wedding had been a rushed, shabby chic affair in a generic community hall in the valley, decorated with grocery store carnations and a palpable sense of defeat. Thatcher Barnes, the notoriously frugal fiancé, looked like he was checking his watch in every photo. Agnes looked like she was holding back a scream behind a veil that was clearly off the rack. The high society style had been stripped away, leaving only the naked truth of two people who valued optics over substance. Rumor had it that the Barnes family had pulled the plug on the remaining budget the moment they realized my mother's wealth was just a house of cards held together by my quiet labor. I took a sip of my coffee and felt a strange, quiet peace. I didn't feel joy at their misfortune. I felt the clinical satisfaction of a job done right. When you ignore the rot in the floorboards for decades, you shouldn't be surprised when the piano falls through to the basement. Vanessa lived only 10 minutes away, yet we were worlds apart. I had instructed Cole Morgan to finalize the no-contact agreement. She had tried to send one last peace offering, a gift box of those organic lavender macarons, with a note claiming she'd only done it for the good of the family. I had dropped the box, unopened, into the trash bin at the firm. Love doesn't steal from the next generation to pay for the vanity of the current one. I entered my office, the sunlight hitting my drafting table in clean, straight lines. I wasn't working on a project for a Newport socialite. I was sketching the preliminary designs for a pro bono marine education center I wanted to help fund in Laguna. The cruel dollar bill was gone, likely spent or lost in the chaos of my mother's financial ruin. But the lesson it taught me that some things are too expensive to be bought with silence was etched into the very foundation of my new life. I picked up my pencil, the lead hitting the paper with a precise, satisfying click. I was finally building something that would stand the test of time.
The silence lasted exactly 1 second before the illusion of our civilized Thanksgiving dinner shattered completely. Madison did not gasp in shock. She did not cry. She erupted. Her chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor as she lunged across the mahogany table with terrifying speed. Her manicured hand flew through the air, and before I could even brace myself, she slapped me hard across the left side of my face. The sharp cracking sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the dining room. The sheer force of her swing knocked her arm directly into my full glass of expensive Cabernet Sauvignon. The crystal shattered against the table edge, sending a tidal wave of dark red wine splashing heavily onto my pristine white silk dress. The cold liquid soaked instantly through the expensive fabric, leaving a massive blood-like stain across my chest and lap. My cheek burned with a stinging, furious heat, the imprint of her heavy diamond rings leaving a sharp scratch near my jawline. I sat perfectly still, my breathing slow and measured, waiting for the inevitable parental intervention. I waited for my father to shout at her for resorting to physical violence. I waited for my mother to hand me a napkin and ask if I was hurt. Neither of those things happened. Instead, my mother leaped from her chair and rushed entirely around the table, completely ignoring my bleeding cheek and ruined dress. She grabbed Madison by the shoulders, her voice trembling with frantic, misplaced concern. "Madison, sweetie, are you all right? Take deep breaths. Remember the baby. Did any of the glass cut you? Did that awful wine ruin your maternity gown?" Madison clutched her stomach, performing a dramatic, breathless sob that belonged on a soap opera. She leaned heavily against Jamal, burying her face in his tailored shoulder. "She is trying to destroy us, Mom. She is fabricating these disgusting lies to ruin my marriage and stress out my baby. I cannot believe my own sister would be this evil." My father slammed his heavy fist down on the table with enough force to rattle the serving dishes. His face was purple with pure rage, a vein bulging visibly in his neck. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "You are a sick, twisted girl, Becca!" he roared, his spit flying across the table. "I invited you into my home out of pure pity. We threw you a lifeline today, a chance to be part of something great, and this is how you repay us, by presenting forged fake documents at the dinner table to tear down a brilliant man. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter spinster who cannot stand the sight of a happy marriage." "Dad, the documents on that iPad have official SEC watermarks," I said, keeping my voice incredibly flat, refusing to let my emotions bleed through. "I am a distressed debt investor. I analyze financial fraud for a living. I am trying to protect you from federal investigations before Jamal takes everything you own." "Shut your mouth," he bellowed, cutting me off completely. "You are just furious because no man wants you. You look at your sister carrying a beautiful child, building a brilliant future with a highly successful CEO, and it eats you alive. You have spent your entire adult life trying to tear her down just because you are incapable of finding love or building a real family of your own." My mother turned her glare toward me, her eyes narrowing with absolute contempt. "You always do this, Becca. You always have to be the center of attention and ruin everything. When Madison had her beautiful wedding, you threw a tantrum about your college fund and moved out. Now she is pregnant and you are literally inventing financial crimes just to steal her spotlight. You are socially unfit for this family." Jamal stood up, adjusting his suit jacket with a look of profound manufactured disappointment. He played the victim with chilling perfection. "Richard, Patricia, I am so deeply sorry my success has caused this kind of toxic jealousy in your home. Becca, if you needed financial help, you could have just asked me. You did not have to invent these ridiculous conspiracy theories about my accounts. My investors are some of the most respected venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. You are just a debt collector. You simply do not understand high-level tech valuations." I slowly wiped a drop of red wine from my chin, locking eyes with my brother-in-law. "Venture capitalists do not wire seed funding to personal accounts in the Cayman Islands, Jamal, and they certainly do not use investor capital to pay off Madison's black card." My father slammed his fist down again, permanently silencing the room. The rage in his eyes was absolute. There was no father looking at a daughter in that moment. There was only an arrogant, status-obsessed man defending his fragile ego and his golden child. He marched to the front of the dining room and pointed a rigid finger toward the heavy oak front door. Outside, the freezing New York winter wind was howling, whipping heavy snow against the glass panes. You are a toxic, cold-hearted snake, Becca. I will not allow you to poison this family for one more second. Richard declared, his voice dripping with finality. Get out of my house and never come back. Any normal person would have broken down right there. Any normal daughter would have cried, pleaded her case, or screamed at the sheer injustice of being assaulted, gaslit, and banished while trying to save her family from total financial ruin. But I was not a normal daughter anymore. They had killed that vulnerable version of me 15 years ago. I stood up slowly, the soaked silk of my dress clinging uncomfortably to my skin. I did not shed a single tear. I did not beg. I reached up and gently touched my stinging red cheek, feeling the slight trace of blood where Madison's ring had scratched me. Then I looked at my father, looked at Madison, hiding behind her con artist husband, and I smiled. It was a chilling, dead-eyed smile that made the temperature in the dining room drop another 10 degrees. I let the silence stretch, allowing my unsettling smile to burn itself into their memories. Slowly and deliberately, I picked up a clean linen napkin from the table. I did not dab at my ruined silk dress. I brought the cloth to my cheek, wiping away the small bead of blood and the splattered wine with absolute terrifying calm. I folded the napkin into a perfect square and placed it gently next to my untouched dinner plate. I turned my back on them and walked toward the grand foyer. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished Italian marble floor, a steady beat that echoed through the cavernous space. My mother could not let me leave in peace. Patricia followed right on my heels, her voice rising in a shrill crescendo of insults as I opened the mahogany coat closet. You are a disgrace, she spat, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. We invite you here out of the goodness of our hearts, and you act like a savage. Look at you. You are 33 years old, and you have absolutely nothing to show for it. No husband, no children, just a sad, pathetic little apartment and a worthless career. I slid my arms into my black cashmere coat, adjusting the collar. I did not look at her yet. I just let her talk. You think you are so smart, Patricia scoffed, pacing behind me. You think looking at spreadsheets makes you superior. You are nothing but a glorified debt collector, a bottom feeder. You scavenge off other people's misery, while Jamal and Madison are actually creating value in this world. You are a vulture, Becca. That is why nobody wants you. I picked up my leather handbag and my car keys. I turned to face her, catching sight of Richard Madison and Jamal standing at the entrance to the dining room, watching my departure like a victorious royal court banishing a peasant. A vulture? I repeated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. That is a very interesting choice of words, Mom, because vultures only circle when they smell something dead. My father sneered, stepping up beside my mother. Just get out, and do not expect a phone call on Christmas. You are dead to us. I wrapped my scarf around my neck and placed my hand on the heavy brass handle of the front door. The chill of the metal seeped through my gloves. I looked at the four of them, memorizing the arrogant, secure expressions on their faces. I will gladly leave, I said, my voice echoing clearly through the grand foyer. But I highly suggest you go back in there and eat as much of that roasted turkey as you possibly can. Savor the expensive wine. Enjoy the warmth of that fireplace. Madison rolled her eyes, leaning her head on Jamal's shoulder. Oh my God, stop being so dramatic and just leave. I ignored her, locking my gaze directly onto my father. Because by sunrise, Richard, not a single plate, not a single chair, and not a single brick in this house will belong to you. Madison threw her head back and let out a loud, mocking laugh. It was that sharp, condescending sound she had used to belittle me since we were teenagers. You are completely insane, she giggled, waving her diamond-clad hand at me. You are literally making empty threats because you are embarrassed. Just go home to your cats, Becca. Richard shook his head in disgust. Pathetic. Absolutely pathetic. But I was not looking at Madison, and I was not looking at Richard. I was looking at Jamal. His fake $1 million smile had completely vanished. The arrogant posture he had maintained all evening had collapsed. His eyes were wide, darting from my face to the iPad still resting on the dining room table and back to my eyes. He was a con artist, and con artists possessed an animal instinct for survival. He recognized the exact moment the hunt shifted. He knew I was not making a scene out of jealousy. He knew I worked in distressed debt. He knew I bought up toxic liabilities. And most importantly, he knew his own dark secrets. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. I pushed down the heavy brass handle and pulled the front door open. The freezing New York winter wind howled into the foyer, blasting snow across the polished marble floor. The sudden drop in temperature made my mother gasp and cross her arms tighter. "Happy Thanksgiving," I said, stepping out into the brutal cold and pulling the door firmly shut behind me. The freezing air whipped against my wet dress beneath my coat, biting into my skin, but I felt absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated focus. I walked down the brick pathway toward my Range Rover, parked in the circular driveway. The snow was falling heavily now, coating the manicured lawns of Greenwich in a thick layer of white. I unlocked my car, the headlights flashing in the dark. Before I could even reach the handle, the heavy front door of the mansion burst open behind me. "Wait." The panicked shout cut through the howling wind. I turned around. Jamal came sprinting out into the freezing snow. He had not even stopped to grab his coat. He was running across the icy driveway in his expensive tailored suit, his dress shoes slipping on the slick bricks. The confident tech CEO was gone, replaced by a desperate, terrified man who had just realized the floor beneath his feet was made of glass and I was holding the hammer. I stood by my car door watching him scramble toward me, knowing exactly what was about to happen. Jamal closed the distance between us in seconds. The heavy snow was already accumulating on the shoulders of his custom-tailored suit jacket, melting instantly against his heated, panicked skin. His expensive leather loafers lost traction on the icy driveway, causing him to stumble awkwardly before he caught his balance. The polished, charismatic executive who had just been holding court in my parents' dining room was completely erased. In his place stood a frantic, sweating man whose carefully constructed house of cards was suddenly vibrating under the weight of severe reality. He did not stop at a polite conversational distance. He kept walking until he was mere inches away from me, using his commanding height to loom over my frame. His broad shoulders blocked out the warm glow of the mansion's porch lights, casting a dark, imposing shadow over me. He took another step forward deliberately, backing me right up against the freezing metal door of my Range Rover. It was a classic corporate intimidation tactic. Use physical space to dominate, project blind aggression, force the opponent to shrink and submit. I felt the icy steel of the car door pressing through my cashmere coat, but I kept my spine perfectly straight. I did not shrink. I tilted my chin up and met his furious, panicked gaze without a single flinch. "Listen to me very carefully, Becca," Jamal hissed, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl that my parents had never heard. The smooth, charming cadence he used to woo my father was entirely absent. "I do not know what kind of sick game you think you are playing in there. I do not know what fake spreadsheets you managed to scrape together to try and ruin my night. But you are going to walk away right now and keep your damn mouth shut. Do you understand me? You are not going to say another word to Richard, to Patricia, or to anyone in my professional network." I remained perfectly silent, studying the erratic pulse beating rapidly at the base of his neck. My calculated silence only made him angrier. He slammed his hand flat against the window of my car, trapping me between his arms. "I know people, Becca," he threatened, leaning in closer, a cloud of expensive cologne and hot breath washing over my face. "Powerful people. I sit on boards with venture capitalists who can crush your little debt collection career with one phone call. I will drag your name through the mud in every financial circle in Manhattan. I will tell them you are unstable, that you fabricate documents out of petty family jealousy. I will sue you for corporate espionage and defamation until you are living out of a cardboard box. If you try to sabotage my investors, I will personally guarantee that you never work in this industry again." When the threats failed to produce a reaction, his eyes darted around the snowy driveway. The panic was starting to override his anger. He lowered his voice, shifting to a desperate conspiratorial whisper. "Look, I can cut you in," Jamal offered, trying to deploy his salesman charm. 10% of the Series B funding, pure liquid cash. Just walk away and let me secure this bridge loan. You are a businesswoman. Let us make a deal." He expected fear. He expected me to apologize or at least attempt to negotiate his bribe. He expected the traditional dynamic where men like him bullied and bought women like me into submission. I reached up and calmly brushed a snowflake from the lapel of his ruined suit. 074299881-400, I said. My voice was steady, quiet, and absolutely lethal. Jamal stopped breathing. The aggressive posture instantly drained from his body. His hands, which had been gripping the roof of my car, fell limp to his sides. That is the exact routing and account number for the offshore shell corporation you registered under Madison's maiden name in the Cayman Islands. I continued speaking slowly, so every single syllable could carve its way into his panicked brain. An account that is currently holding precisely $4,822,614.32. I watched the color completely drain from his face. The snowy night air was well below freezing, but a fresh bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, choking sound came out. You set up a fake vendor shell in Delaware, I explained, maintaining intense, unwavering eye contact. You invoiced your own startup for phantom server infrastructure costs and funneled the seed capital straight into that offshore account. On October 12th, you wired $600,000. On November 3rd, you wired another $1 million. You used that stolen capital to buy my father's affection. You used it to lease Madison's sports cars. You used it to buy the illusion of success. How? Jamal gasped, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the single word. How do you know those numbers? Those accounts are encrypted. They are buried behind layers of dummy corporations. I buy bad debt, Jamal, I replied, my tone devoid of any empathy. I do not just look at what people owe. I track exactly where the money went. When I find a leak, I follow the pipes. You thought you were a genius for moving money offshore, but you left digital fingerprints all over the wire transfers because you were too arrogant to hire a real financial cleaner. You left a trail a mile wide. Jamal took a physical step back, his legs visibly shaking. The intimidating, towering posture was completely broken. He looked exactly like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner's hand move toward the lever. He wrapped his arms around himself, suddenly violently aware of the freezing temperature. He began hyperventilating, his breath coming in short, ragged white clouds as the absolute reality of his destruction settled over him. I stepped forward, closing the distance he had just created. I raised my hand and firmly tapped my index finger twice against his chest, right over his racing heart. You do not have investors, Jamal, I said softly, delivering the final fatal blow to his ego. You have victims, and I own you. I turned my back on his gasping, trembling figure. I opened the heavy door to my Range Rover, slid into the heated leather seat, and started the engine. The powerful roar of the motor cut through the winter wind. I shifted the car into drive and pressed the gas pedal. As I pulled out of the circular driveway and headed down the dark, snow-covered street, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Jamal was still standing there in the freezing storm, clutching his chest, hyperventilating in the snow as his entire fraudulent empire crumbled to dust. The heated leather steering wheel of my Range Rover felt grounding beneath my bare hands. I turned the climate control onto maximum, letting the dry, hot air blast away the lingering chill of the Greenwich snowstorm and the toxic residue of my family's dining room. The heavy all-terrain tires crunched satisfyingly over the fresh powder as I navigated the winding, tree-lined streets of the ultra-wealthy neighborhood. These were the exact streets I was banished from 15 years ago, when I had nothing but a duffel bag and a shattered heart. Tonight, I was driving through them as an executioner. I tapped the touchscreen on my dashboard, bypassing the cheerful holiday music stations, and initiated a secure encrypted call. It rang exactly twice. My lead attorney, Victor, never slept when a major financial play was in motion. Tell me you did not actually eat the stuffing, Becca. Victor's voice filled the quiet cabin of the SUV, his tone crisp and alert despite the late hour. I hear Patricia uses canned broth and tries to pass it off as homemade. I barely survived the appetizers, I replied, keeping my eyes locked on the icy road ahead. They served a healthy portion of delusion garnished with a physical assault. Madison slapped me. Richard threw me out into the snow. A sharp, aggressive intake of breath hissed through the car speakers. Assault. Do you want me to dispatch local law enforcement right now? We can have her arrested for battery before the dessert plates are even cleared from their table. No, I said, a genuine, chilling smile finally touching my lips in the darkness of the car. Handcuffs are entirely too temporary for what they deserve. I prefer permanent generational ruin. Give me the current status on the Greenwich portfolio. I heard the rapid, precise clacking of a mechanical keyboard on Victor's end. Pulling up the master file now. Your father truly is a spectacular study in financial incompetence. To maintain the illusion of being old money, Richard quietly leveraged the family estate to the absolute brink. 2 years ago, when Jamal's fake tech company needed quote-unquote seed capital to keep up appearances, Richard could not secure a traditional bank loan. His credit profile was already bleeding out from Patricia's exorbitant country club fees and Madison's luxury lifestyle. So he went to the shadow markets, I prompted, already knowing the answer but needing to hear the trap confirmed out loud. Exactly, Victor said, his tone dripping with professional disgust. He took out a massive predatory mezzanine loan from a secondary private equity group. $4.5 million. The terms were absolutely toxic, Becca. 18% interest. A balloon payment structure specifically designed to force an eventual default. And your father was arrogant enough to cross-collateralize it with everything he had left to his name. The house, the Mercedes G-Wagon, Madison's Porsche Cayenne, even Patricia's jewelry collection. He literally bet his entire existence on Jamal's startup going public and making him a billionaire. And the original lenders bundled that toxic debt and put it on the secondary market to offload the risk. I said, the heater finally warming the damp wine-soaked silk of my dress. Which is exactly where we swooped in, Victor confirmed, a hint of dark corporate triumph ringing in his voice. 6 months ago, our distressed debt fund utilized a blind proxy LLC to purchase that specific portfolio for pennies on the dollar. We acquired the paper, the liens, the collateral rights, everything. Richard thinks he owes money to a faceless corporate entity registered to a post office box in Delaware. He has absolutely no idea that his ultimate creditor, the entity holding the financial leash around his neck, is his own discarded daughter. I navigated a sharp turn, the heavy vehicle gripping the black ice flawlessly. Has he tried to make contact with the proxy servicer today? He has been calling the automated line non-stop since Monday morning, Victor chuckled softly, leaving desperate, sweaty voicemails. He has missed 3 consecutive monthly payments, Becca. He is completely tapped out of liquid cash. He keeps begging the automated machine for a forbearance, claiming his son-in-law is about to close a massive venture capital round that will clear the entire balance. He genuinely thinks he can charm his way out of a legally binding default. There is no venture capital round, I said flatly, my voice stripped of all empathy. Jamal is currently experiencing a total psychological collapse in the snow outside the estate. The fake money is gone. Richard has nothing left to leverage. Then the trap is officially set, Victor stated, shifting back to strict, ruthless legal protocol. The demand notices were properly served to his registered P.O. box 30 days ago. We have followed every single state and federal regulation regarding asset seizure to the letter. The paperwork is flawless, Becca. There are no loopholes. We just need the clock to run out. I glanced down at the glowing digital clock on the center console of my dashboard. The bright white numbers stared back at me in the dark cabin. 11:45 p.m. Thanksgiving Day was in its final death throes. The frenzied consumerist chaos of Black Friday was looming just beyond the horizon. The final grace period for his 3rd missed payment. I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper as a heavy surge of adrenaline spiked through my veins. What is the exact expiration time? Midnight. Victor answered immediately, the sound of keyboard clicking stopping entirely. The contract specifically stipulates that the cure period expires at exactly 12:00 a.m. on the Friday following the Thanksgiving holiday. If the outstanding balance of $4.5 million is not wired into our holding account by the time that clock strikes 12, the loan goes into automatic irreversible default. The acceleration clause kicks in instantly. All collateral becomes our immediate legal property. 15 minutes. In exactly 15 minutes, the house where I was told I was useless, the dining room where I was humiliated, the driveway where I was banished, would legally belong to me. My father had spent 33 years building a kingdom of arrogance, entitlement, and exclusivity. I was about to repossess it before he even finished digesting his holiday meal. "Stand by, Victor," I said, my eyes fixed on the dark snow-swept road illuminated by my high beams. "Have the asset seizure teams and the process servers ready on a secure line. Nobody sleeps tonight." "Standing by," Victor confirmed smoothly. "It is your call, boss." I kept my foot steady on the accelerator. The dashboard clock clicked to 11:46 p.m. The countdown to their absolute destruction had officially begun. I navigated the icy, winding roads away from the sprawling Greenwich estates, eventually pulling the Range Rover onto a secluded, scenic overlook. Below me, the Hudson River churned like liquid obsidian, a dark void separating the quiet, insulated wealth of the suburbs from the towering electric grid of the Manhattan skyline. The city glowed against the dark winter sky, a sprawling monument to power and capital. That same skyline used to terrify me when I arrived there at 18, completely broke, shivering in a cheap coat after my parents drained my college fund. Back then, I was a victim. Now the city was my playground. I owned pieces of those steel and glass towers. I dictated the flow of capital that kept their lights on. And tonight, I was using that immense power to obliterate the very people who thought they had buried me. I put the car in park and kept the engine running, letting the heater blow dry, hot air through the cabin as the snow continued to fall violently outside. I glanced at the digital display on the dashboard. 11:50 p.m., 10 minutes left. I picked up my encrypted tablet from the passenger seat and opened the secure banking portal connected to my distressed debt fund. The interface was stark and minimalist, displaying a single massive liability account registered to Richard. The balance sat there in bright red, unforgiving numerals: $4.5 million. It was a staggering amount of negative leverage for a man who desperately pretended to be an untouchable aristocrat. I watched the seconds tick by, feeling a strange, hollow calmness settling deep in my chest. A weaker person might have felt a twinge of guilt. A traditional daughter might have picked up the phone, called her father, and offered him one final chance to negotiate, to apologize, to beg for a sliver of mercy. But Richard and Patricia had spent my entire life teaching me that mercy was nothing but a vulnerability. They had demonstrated just an hour ago that they would gladly throw me to the wolves to protect Madison and her fraudulent, silver-tongued husband. They had made their choices with absolute arrogance. Now they were going to choke on the severe, unyielding consequences. 11:55 p.m. I tapped my manicured fingernails rhythmically against the heated leather steering wheel. The snow thickened, masking the luxury homes behind me in a heavy blanket of white isolation. They were trapped in their mansion, completely unaware of the financial avalanche suspended right above their heads. 11:58 p.m. My phone screen lit up with an incoming secure call. It was Victor. I tapped the screen to answer, routing his voice through the SUV sound system. "We are at the wire, Becca," Victor said, his voice stripped of any casual banter. He was in full execution mode, now operating as the ruthless corporate attorney I paid handsomely to enact my exact will. "The automated clearinghouse system has run its final sweep for the day. Richard has not initiated any wire transfers. He has not posted a bond. He has not deposited a single cent into the holding account to cure the delinquency. The account remains severely delinquent." I kept my eyes locked on the dashboard clock. 11:59 p.m. The final 60 seconds stretched out taut and heavy with adrenaline. I did not blink. I did not take a single breath. I just watched the digital numbers prepare to shift. "He is banking on his status," I said, my voice echoing coldly in the quiet car. "He thinks he can call the loan servicer on Monday morning, drop a few names, and charm his way out of a default. He thinks the rules do not apply to him because he lives in Greenwich." "The rules of compound interest apply to everyone," Victor replied sharply. Midnight, 12:00 a.m. A sharp, high-pitched ping echoed through the cabin of my car from the tablet. A bright red automated alert flashed across the high-definition screen. "Status update default confirmed." "It is midnight," I announced, feeling a surge of pure, unfiltered power rush through my veins. "The grace period is officially dead." "Confirmed." Victor stated immediately, the rapid clicking of his keyboard returning. Richard is in total breach of contract. We are now legally authorized to execute the acceleration clause. This will demand the immediate total repayment of the $4.5 million principal, plus all accrued interest, default penalties, and legal fees. Do you want me to issue a standard 72-hour warning notice first, or do we go straight to the nuclear option? I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. No warnings, no grace periods, no courtesy calls. Trigger the acceleration clause immediately. I want the immediate freeze of all cross-collateralized assets. Lock down his checking accounts, his savings accounts, and his investment portfolios. Send the electronic seizure notices to his banks right now so he cannot wire a single dollar out of those accounts to hide it. File the emergency liens against the Greenwich estate and freeze the titles to both the Mercedes and the Porsche. Executing total asset freeze protocol, Victor confirmed smoothly. We are dropping a financial iron curtain over their entire existence. The banking algorithms will lock them out instantly. Any credit card tied to those accounts will trigger a hard decline code. They will be entirely cut off from their own capital by sunrise. Make it happen, I commanded. I pulled up the execution authorization file on my tablet. The legal document required one final digital signature from the fund manager to deploy the highly coordinated strike. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. A green checkmark illuminated the screen, verifying my identity and locking my command into the system. The digital clock shifted to 12:01 a.m. I hit send. The transmission bar filled instantly, uploading the kill switch directly into the global banking network. The dominoes had officially begun to fall. Miles away inside the suffocating warmth of the Greenwich mansion, the reality of my digital strike had not yet materialized. The grand living room was a portrait of oblivious privilege. The massive stone fireplace crackled, casting a golden glow over the imported Italian leather sofas. Madison and Patricia had completely brushed off my departure. To them, my exit was just another dramatic tantrum from the jealous, bitter sister. They had quickly returned to their true passion, which was mindless, exorbitant consumption. Madison lounged horizontally across the sofa, resting her iPad on her pregnant belly. She was hyper-focused on the midnight Black Friday designer, drops her fingers flying across the glossy screen. She was building an online shopping cart that bordered on the obscene. A limited edition imported baby stroller worth more than a reliable used car. Matching rose gold Cartier watches for her and Jamal. A bespoke suite of European maternity wear. She was preparing to spend tens of thousands of dollars, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was currently outside in the freezing snow, experiencing a total psychological collapse. The digital clock on her screen shifted to 12:02. Madison casually tapped the checkout button, authorizing the massive charge to her American Express Centurion card. She expected the familiar, satisfying chime of a completed purchase. Instead, the screen loaded, the little circle spinning for a few seconds longer than usual. Then a sharp, aggressive red notification banner dropped down from the top of her iPad. Payment declined. Please contact your card issuer. Madison scoffed aloud, rolling her eyes at the inconvenience. She muttered a complaint about fraud protection algorithms being entirely too sensitive during holiday sales. Without a second thought, she reached into her designer wallet, pulled out a heavy platinum Visa, and rapidly typed in the secondary numbers. She hit submit again. Another spinning wheel. Another bright red banner. Transaction denied. Account frozen. Annoyance quickly shifted to genuine frustration. Madison kicked off her cashmere blanket and nudged our mother. She complained that the banking servers must be crashing from all the holiday traffic, blaming the digital bottleneck on the working-class masses fighting over discounted electronics. Patricia, eager to secure her own cart of marked-down Prada handbags and expensive skincare sets, waved her off with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "Just use my card, sweetie," Patricia said, tapping the checkout button on her own device. Her screen froze for a fraction of a second, then violently rejected the transaction. Hard decline code. Patricia frowned, her perfectly manicured fingernail tapping the screen aggressively. She tried a different card, one linked directly to Richard's primary checking account. Declined. insufficient funds, or account suspended. The harsh uppercase words glared at them in the dimly lit living room, completely out of place in their world of endless capital. Patricia stood up, her expensive silk robe rustling against her ankles, and marched down the long carpeted hallway. She headed straight to Richard's ground floor study, where he had retreated with a glass of bourbon after throwing me out into the blizzard. She burst through his heavy oak doors without knocking, demanding his physical wallet. She claimed the banks were experiencing a ridiculous holiday glitch, and she needed his direct corporate black card to bypass the system. Richard, exhausted and still nursing his bruised ego from our dinner confrontation, handed it over with a heavy grumble. He told her to hurry up and let him sleep. Patricia marched triumphantly back to the living room. She typed the elite corporate card details into the checkout portal and hit submit with absolute confidence. For a third time, the bright red error message illuminated her angry face. Call your financial institution immediately. The arrogant, untouchable security of the Greenwich mansion began to rot from the inside out. Madison, breathing heavily now, tried to log directly into her mobile banking app to check her balances. The app refused her facial recognition. It threw up a stark white warning screen. Access revoked. Please contact customer service regarding foreclosure and asset seizure proceedings. Madison dropped her phone onto the plush Persian rug, her hands suddenly trembling uncontrollably. Patricia stared at her own frozen screen, the horrifying realization slowly crawling up her spine. The banking glitch was not a glitch. The threats I had made in the grand foyer just an hour ago echoed loudly in her ears. By sunrise, not a single plate, not a single chair, and not a single brick in this house will belong to you. Back in my Range Rover, parked high above the Hudson River, the absolute silence of the night was broken by the aggressive, rapid ringing of my cell phone. The caller ID flashed brightly with my mother's name. I did not answer. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Then it rang again, and again. Patricia was relentlessly blowing up my phone, her previous brutal declarations that I was dead to the family completely forgotten in the face of financial terror. After the fifth consecutive missed call, a notification popped up indicating a new voicemail. I connected the phone to the car's Bluetooth system and pressed play. I leaned back into my heated leather seat, ready to listen to the beautiful symphony of her panic. Patricia's voice blasted through the premium car speakers. It was shrill, unhinged, and completely stripped of all her refined upper-class polish. "Becca, you vindictive little witch!" Patricia screamed into the receiver, her voice cracking with hysteria. "I know you did something to our accounts. I know you hacked the bank. You work in finance. You manipulated the system just to ruin Madison's shopping because you are a jealous psycho. Turn the cards back on right now. Your father is calling the police. You are going to federal prison for cybercrime, do you hear me? Call me back and fix this immediately." I let the voicemail end. The quiet, peaceful silence returned to my car. Patricia still thought this was a petty prank. She still genuinely believed she held the moral high ground that she could command me to fix a temporary inconvenience. She had absolutely no comprehension of the massive legal avalanche that was currently crushing her entire existence. I did not call her back. I did not send a defensive text message denying her ridiculous hacking accusations. Instead, I opened the family group chat. It was a digital space I had been forced to sit in for years, enduring their constant bragging and subtle daily insults. I copied a specific URL from my secure legal portal. I pasted that single link into the text box. I hit send, locked my phone screen, and tossed the device onto the passenger seat, letting the digital bomb detonate in the palm of their hands. I did not need to be standing inside the grand living room of the Greenwich mansion to know exactly how the digital detonation played out. The shockwave was a mathematical certainty. Inside the stifling warmth of the house, the synchronized chime of cell phones pierced the panicked atmosphere. Patricia, still breathing heavily from leaving her unhinged voicemails, snatched her phone from the coffee table. Madison, whose face was stained with mascara and frustration over her declined credit cards, leaned over her mother's shoulder. Richard, nursing his second glass of expensive bourbon by the fireplace, felt his own phone vibrate in the breast pocket of his trousers. He pulled the device out with a heavy sigh, expecting another angry text message from me complaining about my banishment. Instead, he saw a single raw web address glowing on his screen. It was a direct link to a government domain. Richard tapped the link. The Safari browser loaded for a fraction of a second before the official, unmistakable seal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission materialized on his screen. It was an emergency asset freeze and cease and desist order. Richard squinted, his alcohol-laced brain struggling to process the dense federal legal jargon. He scrolled past the preliminary injunction warnings and landed directly on the summary of the enforcement action. The words on the glowing screen hit him with the force of a speeding freight train. Defendant Jamal, charge wire fraud, embezzlement, and operating an unregistered securities offering. Richard stopped breathing. The expensive bourbon sloshed dangerously close to the rim of his crystal glass. He swiped his thumb up the screen, his eyes scanning the horrifying details compiled by federal investigators. The document outlined a brazen, systematic Ponzi scheme. It detailed how Jamal had fabricated user acquisition metrics, falsified revenue reports, and funneled millions of dollars of investor capital into offshore shell companies hidden in the Cayman Islands. It explicitly confirmed the exact routing numbers and account balances I had recited to Jamal in the freezing driveway just minutes earlier. But the true fatal blow to my father's ego was buried in page 4 of the Asset Tracing Annex. Richard forced himself to read the paragraph detailing the flow of the most recent capital injection. The federal investigators had tracked a massive high-interest mezzanine loan of $4.5 million. The document listed the origin of that capital. It named the exact private equity firm Richard had quietly borrowed the money from. It named the Greenwich estate as the primary collateral. And then, in cold, undeniable federal print, it revealed exactly where Richard's borrowed money had gone. Jamal had not used a single cent of Richard's $4.5 million to build proprietary algorithms or secure a tech initial public offering. The SEC document traced the funds directly to the immediate repayment of early-stage defrauded investors to keep them quiet, alongside massive six-figure transfers to cover high-end luxury car leases, private jet charters, and exorbitant personal credit card bills. The money was gone. The realization crashed down on Richard, crushing the air out of his lungs. He had risked his home, his cars, his wife's jewelry, and his entire financial existence to fund the lifestyle of a parasite. He had banished his own daughter, the only person who had tried to warn him, the only person who had actually read the fraudulent balance sheets. And he had done it to protect a man who was actively stealing his home right out from under his feet. The heavy crystal bourbon glass slipped from Richard's trembling fingers. It plummeted to the hardwood floor, shattering into dozens of sharp, glittering pieces. The amber liquid splashed across the polished wood and soaked into the fringe of the expensive Persian rug. Patricia jumped at the sudden noise, dropping her own phone onto the sofa. She stared at her husband in alarm. Richard's face had drained of all color, replacing his usual arrogant flush with a terrifying sickly gray. He did not say a word to his wife. He did not answer Madison when she demanded to know what the link meant. The sophisticated, upper-class patriarch was completely gone. In his place stood a ruined, desperate man who had just realized his entire kingdom was built on quicksand. Richard turned on his heel and marched out of the living room. His heavy footsteps pounded against the carpeted hallway, accelerating with every stride. He knew exactly where Jamal was. After I had left Jamal hyperventilating in the snow, the coward had slinked around to the side entrance of the mansion, bypassing the living room to avoid questions. Jamal had retreated to the first-floor guest suite, locking himself inside to panic in private. Richard reached the heavy oak door of the guest suite. He did not knock. He did not ask permission to enter. Lifting his leg, Richard drove the flat sole of his leather shoe directly into the wood, right next to the brass door handle. The door frame splintered violently with a loud crack, the metal lock giving way under the sheer force of his absolute rage. The door banged open, bouncing hard against the interior wall. Jamal flinched violently. He was standing near the foot of the king-sized bed, still wearing his soaked, freezing suit trousers, though he had discarded his ruined jacket. He was frantically stuffing a stack of customized passports, several expensive watches, and thick-banded stacks of emergency cash into a designer leather duffel bag. He was attempting to flee before the federal agents arrived. Richard stepped over the splintered wood, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were completely white. "You stole my house!" Richard roared, the sound tearing through the mansion like thunder. Jamal backed away, holding his hands up defensively, his charismatic smile replaced by pure cornered terror. He stammered, trying to deploy one last desperate lie, trying to claim the SEC document was a misunderstanding, a competitor's smear campaign, a temporary regulatory hurdle. Richard did not let him finish a single sentence. My father lunged across the bedroom. He grabbed Jamal by the collar of his wet, expensive dress shirt, twisting the fabric tightly in his fists. He slammed the younger, taller man backward into the heavy mahogany dresser. Framed photographs and decorative vases crashed to the floor, shattering glass across the expensive carpet. A vicious, uncontrolled physical fight broke out between the two men of the house. Jamal, desperate to escape federal prison, threw a panicked punch, catching Richard on the side of the jaw. But Richard possessed the terrifying adrenaline-fueled strength of a man who had just lost everything. He tackled Jamal to the floor, pinning him against the edge of the bed frame. In the hallway behind them, Patricia and Madison finally arrived at the shattered doorway. Patricia began screaming hysterically, clutching her face as she watched her husband and her beloved son-in-law brutally tearing each other apart. Madison shrieked, begging them to stop, her hands hovering protectively over her pregnant belly. But there was no stopping the violence. It was the physical manifestation of their financial ruin. The sophisticated, wealthy family image they had guarded so fiercely was dead, replaced by blood-shattered glass and absolute unforgiving betrayal. The physical fight was brutal, entirely stripped of the country club refinement my father had spent decades cultivating. Richard drove his knee into Jamal's ribs, pinning the younger man against the shattered remains of the mahogany dresser. Jamal swung blindly, his knuckles catching Richard on the cheekbone with a sickening thud. The two men crashed onto the expensive Turkish rug, knocking over a heavy brass floor lamp that smashed into the drywall. Patricia stood in the ruined doorway, clutching the sides of her face. She unleashed a piercing, hysterical scream, the kind of raw, unfiltered noise she would have previously deemed entirely too low class for a Greenwich neighborhood. She rushed forward, grabbing the back of Richard's ruined button-down shirt, desperately trying to pull him off her son-in-law. Madison did not try to stop the violence for the sake of peace. She threw herself into the fray purely to protect her fraudulent husband. She smacked her father repeatedly on the shoulder, screaming at the top of her lungs, her designer maternity dress tearing at the seam. "Get off of him! Get your hands off my husband!" Madison shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You are going to hurt the baby!" Richard shoved Madison aside just hard enough to get her out of his strike zone. He grabbed Jamal by the collar again, hauling the younger man halfway off the floor. Jamal was bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow, his expensive tailored shirt ripped open, revealing a heavy gold chain that Richard had undoubtedly paid for. "Where is my money?" Richard roared, shaking Jamal so violently the man's head snapped back and forth. $4.5 million. You told me it was secured in an escrow account for the initial public offering. The federal government says you wired it to the Cayman Islands. Tell me how to get it back right now or I will kill you myself. Jamal spat a mouthful of blood onto the ruined carpet. The charismatic tech visionary was dead, and the cornered street hustler finally emerged. He let out a harsh, breathless laugh, glaring up at the man who had bankrolled his entire fake empire. "You are an idiot!" "Richard?" Jamal gasped, coughing as he struggled to breathe under my father's weight. "You think that money is just sitting there waiting for you?" "I had early investors threatening to go to the authorities 6 months ago. I had to pay them off to keep the Ponzi scheme from collapsing. And the rest of it? Look around you, old man. Look at your daughter's wrists. Look at the cars in your driveway. You demanded I treat Madison like a queen to maintain your precious family image. You literally paid for your own fake lifestyle." Richard released Jamal's collar, stumbling backward as if he had been physically burned. He hit the wall and slid down his chest, heaving his eyes wide with a terrifying hollow realization. The millions he had secretly borrowed against the family estate, the predatory loan that was charging 18% interest, It was all gone. Vaporized to buy time and designer handbags. "This is Becca's fault," Madison screamed, kneeling beside Jamal and wiping the blood from his face with her bare hands. If she had just signed the guarantor paperwork at dinner, the new bridge loan would have cleared everything. Jamal could have fixed the company. She did this to us on purpose. She called the federal investigators just to ruin my life. Richard slowly turned his head to look at his favorite daughter. For the first time in 35 years, he looked at Madison not as his golden child, but as the spoiled, delusional parasite she truly was. "Shut up, Richard," whispered his voice shaking with absolute venom. "Just shut your mouth, Madison. Your sister did not cause this. Your husband is a federal criminal, and you are a blind, greedy fool who bankrupted your own family." Patricia gasped, rushing to put a protective arm around Madison. "Richard, do not speak to her that way. She is pregnant. We need to figure out a plan. We need to hire lawyers. We need to move whatever cash we have left before the government freezes our personal accounts." The word cash seemed to jolt Richard back to reality. The Securities and Exchange Commission filing had only mentioned freezing Jamal's assets, but Richard knew how federal investigations worked. Once they realized Richard's borrowed funds were tied up in the fraud, they would subpoena his accounts next. He needed to transfer his remaining liquid capital, the last $200,000 he had sitting in his primary checking account, into an untouchable offshore trust he had set up years ago. He scrambled off the floor, ignoring the pain in his jaw and his bruised ribs. He stumbled past Patricia and Madison rushing out of the ruined guest suite and sprinting down the hallway back to his private study. He threw himself into his leather desk chair and slammed his hand against his computer mouse to wake up his monitors. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely type his password. He navigated to his elite banking portal, the one reserved for high-net-worth clients. He typed in his credentials and held his breath, waiting for the familiar interface to load. The screen flashed white. A loading circle spun for 2 agonizing seconds. Then the screen turned a stark, solid black. A single bright red notice appeared directly in the center of the monitor. "Account frozen. Pending foreclosure." Richard stared at the red letters, his brain refusing to process the words. Foreclosure. The bank did not freeze accounts for foreclosure without issuing 90 days of written warnings, default notices, and a massive legal battle. And the SEC did not execute foreclosures, they executed asset freezes. He frantically grabbed his cell phone from his pocket, opening his mobile banking app to try a different route. Face ID scanned his sweaty, bruised face. The exact same red text glared back at him from the palm of his hand. "Account frozen. Pending foreclosure." Then a secondary notification popped up on his screen. It was an automated email from the private equity firm that held his toxic mezzanine loan, the anonymous debt collectors he had been dodging all week. He opened the email with a trembling thumb. Notice of default and immediate acceleration. The document informed him that his grace period had officially expired at midnight. The creditor had exercised their legal right to accelerate the loan. The entire balance of $4.5 million was due immediately. Because he could not pay, the creditor had executed an emergency lien and frozen all cross-collateralized assets, his checking accounts, his savings, the equity in the house. Everything was locked. Richard dropped his phone. It clattered against the mahogany desk. Becca had not just been making a dramatic exit when she told him to enjoy the house because it would not belong to him by sunrise. She had not been bluffing when she claimed she was his legal creditor. She had known about the loan. She had bought the loan. She was the anonymous entity choking the life out of him. She had deliberately waited until he threw her out into the cold to push the button that executed his total financial ruin. He sat in the dark study listening to the muffled sounds of his wife crying and his daughter arguing with her criminal husband down the hall. The reality of his absolute destruction settled heavily over his shoulders. He had absolutely nothing left. No money, no lawyers, no way out. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the half-hour. It was 4:30 in the morning. Richard stared blankly out the large bay windows of his study, watching the heavy snow continue to fall on the dark, quiet streets of Greenwich. The neighborhood was dead silent. Suddenly, the pristine white snow in the front yard was illuminated by a rapid strobing light. Brilliant flashes of bright red and piercing blue cut through the darkness of the winter morning, reflecting violently off the glass window panes and throwing chaotic colored shadows across Richard's ruined face. Multiple heavy vehicle engines idled loudly right outside his front door. The heavy vehicle engines idled loudly outside the front door, a low, menacing rumble that vibrated through the floorboards of the study. Richard stood frozen by the bay window, the alternating red and blue lights washing over his bruised face. For a brief, desperate second, his mind tried to rationalize the flashing lights. He convinced himself that a neighbor had called the local Greenwich precinct to file a noise complaint. The shattering glass and screaming from the guest suite must have echoed across the property line. A noise complaint was manageable. A noise complaint was something a man of his status could wave away with a firm handshake, a forced smile, and a generous donation to the Policeman Benevolent Association. Richard smoothed his trembling hands over the front of his torn, blood-stained dress shirt. He took a deep breath, forcing his chest to expand, attempting to summon the authoritative aura of the wealthy patriarch he had played for decades. He turned away from the window and marched back down the long hallway toward the grand foyer. Patricia and Madison were already standing at the edge of the living room, their faces illuminated by the frantic police lights strobing through the frosted glass of the front door. Patricia clutched her silk robe tightly to her throat, her eyes wide with mounting panic. Madison was hyperventilating, her hands protectively covering her stomach. Jamal was nowhere to be seen, having cowardly barricaded himself back inside the ruined guest bedroom the moment the sirens became audible. "Stay here and keep quiet," Richard barked at his wife and daughter, his voice laced with forced bravado. "It is just the local patrol. I will handle them. Do not say a single word about Jamal or the money." Richard stepped up to the massive double oak doors. He unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open, stepping out onto the covered stone porch, ready to deliver his practiced, condescending charm. The freezing winter wind hit him instantly, but it was not the cold that made his breath catch in his throat. There was no lone patrol car parked in his driveway. The entire front lawn was swarming with law enforcement. 4 marked county sheriff cruisers formed a barricade across the entrance gates. 2 unmarked black SUVs sat idling directly in front of the porch. Standing at the bottom of his snowy steps was not a friendly local beat cop looking to issue a noise warning. Richard found himself staring down the county sheriff, a tall, broad-shouldered man, with a face carved from stone. Flanking the sheriff were 2 heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI emblazoned across their chests. Standing slightly behind the wall of law enforcement was a sharp-suited, entirely calm process server holding a thick, heavy stack of manila legal folders. Richard gripped the doorframe, his knuckles turning white. His practiced smile completely abandoned him. He opened his mouth, trying to deploy the only weapon he had left, his perceived social status. "Officers!" Richard began, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to sound commanding. "There is absolutely no need for this massive display. My family just had a minor private disagreement. We were handling it internally. I am personal friends with the police chief of this district. You are trespassing on private property." The county sheriff did not smile. He did not acknowledge the name drop. He looked at Richard with the cold, absolute indifference of a man who dealt with arrogant fallen executives every single day. "Secure the perimeter," the sheriff ordered, his deep voice cutting through the howling wind. "Agents, the primary suspect for the federal warrant is located inside the premises." The 2 armed FBI agents immediately marched up the stone steps, their boots crunching heavily on the ice. They shoved past Richard without a single word of apology, storming into the grand foyer. Patricia let out a blood-curdling shriek as the federal agents brushed past her, demanding to know the exact location of Jamal. Madison began sobbing hysterically, sinking to her knees on the marble floor as the heavy, aggressive footsteps of the agents echoed down the hallway toward the guest suite. Richard tried to turn around, tried to stop the agents from invading his home, but the county sheriff stepped up onto the porch, physically blocking Richard's path back inside. The sharp-suited process server stepped up beside the sheriff. He did not look intimidated by the massive mansion or the furious man standing in the doorway. He operated with the ruthless mechanical efficiency of the corporate machine. "Are you Richard?" The process server asked, his tone crisp and entirely devoid of emotion. "Yes, I am the owner of this house." Richard spat, his face flushing with fresh, panicked rage. "And I demand to know what gives you the right to tear my home apart at 4:30 in the morning on a holiday weekend." The process server did not engage with the outrage. He simply thrust the heavy stack of manila folders directly into Richard's chest. Richard instinctively raised his arms to catch the thick documents officially accepting service. "Richard, you are hereby served with an emergency writ of execution, an immediate asset seizure mandate, and a notice of foreclosure acceleration." The process server recited rapidly, reading from a prepared legal script. "These orders have been signed, expedited, and fully authorized by a federal judge due to the presence of cross-collateralized assets currently linked to an active federal wire fraud investigation." Richard looked down at the thick stack of papers in his trembling hands. The bold black ink on the top page seemed to burn into his retinas. He saw the exact loan numbers. He saw the list of his assets: the house, the cars, the bank accounts. Everything was documented, categorized, and legally stripped from his possession. And right there, listed under the primary creditor designation, was the corporate LLC that his discarded daughter controlled. Becca had not just frozen his accounts. She had utilized Jamal's federal fraud investigation as a legal catalyst to bypass every single standard foreclosure waiting period. Because Richard had used the house as collateral for the loan, and Jamal had used the house as a physical base of operations for his Ponzi scheme, the property was now officially classified as a compromised asset. Becca's legal team had convinced a judge that Richard was a massive flight risk who was actively destroying the value of the collateral. The judge had granted the emergency seizure order just hours ago. The absolute terrifying reality of his checkmate crashed over Richard. He was not just broke, he was legally evicted. "You cannot do this," Richard gasped, looking wildly from the documents to the sheriff. The freezing wind was tearing through his thin, bloody shirt, but he was sweating profusely. "This is my home. You cannot throw my family out into the snow in the middle of the night. We have rights. I demand to speak to a judge. I demand to call my attorneys." "Your assets are frozen, Richard," the process server stated coldly, stepping back out into the snow. "You do not have attorneys anymore." The county sheriff stepped fully into the foyer, his heavy boots tracking snow onto the pristine marble floor. He looked down at Richard with absolute chilling authority. "You have 30 minutes to vacate the premises. We are taking possession of the property on behalf of the creditor." The sheriff's words echoed off the vaulted ceiling of the grand foyer, hanging in the freezing air that swept through the open doorway. 30 minutes. The countdown struck Patricia with the force of a physical blow. Her perfectly manicured hands flew to her throat as she collapsed against the base of the sweeping mahogany staircase. A harsh, ragged sound ripped from her chest as she began to hyperventilate. The immaculate society matron who had spent decades curating an image of absolute perfection was now gasping for air on her own floor, her silk robe pooling around her trembling knees. She clawed at her chest, her eyes darting wildly around the foyer, taking in the armed federal agents standing on her imported rugs. Richard remained utterly paralyzed in the doorway. He did not rush to comfort his wife. He did not demand the officers show him more respect. His gaze was fixed blindly on the snow-covered lawn, his mind completely shattered by the realization that his entire empire had been legally vaporized by the daughter he had banished just hours prior. Before the absolute silence of their ruin could fully settle, a new terrifying sound fractured the quiet winter morning. It was a deep mechanical roar. Heavy diesel engines rumbled down the pristine tree-lined street of the exclusive Greenwich neighborhood. The distinctive hiss of commercial air brakes echoed through the freezing air. Through the open front doors, Richard watched in fresh horror as two massive heavy-duty tow trucks backed aggressively through the wrought iron gates of the estate. Bright rotating amber lights flared atop the massive trucks, mixing chaotically with the red and blue police strobes already washing over the property. The repo men had arrived. Becca had not simply authorized a digital freeze on the bank accounts. She had ordered the immediate physical repossession of every single cross-collateralized asset tied to the defaulted loan. The financial execution was designed to leave no stone unturned. The two tow trucks maneuvered expertly into the wide, circular driveway, their heavy, studded tires crushing the immaculate landscaping. Two men wearing high-visibility winter jackets hopped down from the cabs. They carried heavy steel chains and hydraulic controls, moving with the practiced, ruthless efficiency of professionals who repossessed vehicles for a living. They did not care about the address. They did not care about the size of the mansion. They only cared about the VIN numbers, matching their digital seizure orders. One of the men walked directly toward the custom white Porsche Cayenne, parked near the garage. The other headed straight for Richard's matte black Mercedes G-Wagon. Inside the hallway, Madison heard the loud crunching of the tires and the heavy clanking of steel chains. She peeked around the corner of the foyer, her tear-streaked face pale with shock. When she saw the high-visibility jackets moving toward her luxury SUV, her fragile grip on reality completely snapped. That Porsche was her ultimate status symbol. It was the vehicle she drove to the country club to flaunt her wealth. It was her entire identity wrapped in German engineering. Madison let out a blood-curdling shriek. She shoved past her hyperventilating mother and bolted out the front door. She did not grab a coat. She did not put on shoes. She sprinted directly out into the brutal -3-degree blizzard, wearing nothing but her thin designer silk maternity pajamas and a pair of velvet house slippers. The freezing snow instantly soaked through the delicate velvet, soaking her bare feet in icy slush. But Madison did not even seem to register the pain. She threw her body between the repo man and the front grille of her Porsche. "Get away from my car!" Madison screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. She swatted frantically at the repo man's heavy winter jacket. "Do you have any idea who I am? My husband is a billionaire tech CEO. You cannot touch this vehicle. It is fully paid off. I will have you fired and sued for everything you own." The repo man did not flinch. He did not argue. He simply looked at the screaming, silk-clad woman with the absolute indifference of a man holding a court-ordered mandate. He pulled a laminated document from his clipboard and held it up in the freezing wind. "Vehicle is registered to Richards Holding LLC, ma'am," the worker stated in a bored, monotone voice. "Title is frozen under a federal writ of execution. Step away from the machinery, or I will have the sheriff remove you for obstructing a legal recovery." "It is my car," Madison wailed, stomping her freezing foot in the snow, acting like a petulant toddler rather than a 35-year-old woman. "It is my baby's car. You are stealing from a pregnant woman. Dad, tell them to stop. Make them stop right now." Richard stood on the porch, a broken shell of a man. He watched the second repo worker drag a heavy steel hook underneath the chassis of his beloved Mercedes G-Wagon. The sickening metallic clank of the chain locking onto the front axle echoed across the driveway. The winch whined loudly, tightening the cable and lifting the front wheels of the aggressive luxury tank right off the icy pavement. Richard could not form a single word to defend his daughter. He had absolutely no power left to project. Madison spun around, realizing her father was useless. The front end of her white Porsche began to lift off the ground, the hydraulic lift groaning under the weight. She grabbed the steel cable with her bare hands, screaming at the top of her lungs, fighting a completely unwinnable battle against a hydraulic winch. The chaos outside drew the attention of the man hiding inside the ruined guest suite. Jamal had been cornered in the bedroom, listening to the federal agents systematically tearing through the house, searching for his financial documents and his hidden passports. When he heard Madison screaming about the cars, something inside his arrogant, desperate mind finally snapped. The cars were the last tangible proof of his fake success. Without the cars, without the mansion, he was nothing but a fraud waiting for a prison cell. Jamal burst through the shattered guest room door. He ignored the federal agents searching the adjacent study and sprinted directly through the grand foyer, leaping over Patricia, who was still sobbing on the floor. He charged out the front doors, his ripped, bloody dress shirt flapping wildly in the winter storm. He saw the repo man operating the hydraulic levers beside the Porsche. Pure, unfiltered panic overrode any remaining common sense. Jamal lunged at the blue-collar worker, grabbing the man by the collar of his high-visibility jacket and throwing a frantic, desperate punch. "Drop the car!" Jamal roared, his face twisted in feral rage. "Unhook the damn car right now!" It was the single worst mistake he could have possibly made. Law enforcement officers do not tolerate physical violence during an active asset seizure. They especially do not tolerate it from the primary suspect named on an interstate wire fraud warrant. The two FBI agents who had followed Jamal out of the house moved with terrifying tactical precision. They did not shout a warning. They did not ask him to calm down. Before Jamal could throw a second punch, the lead federal agent hit him like a freight train. The agent drove his shoulder directly into Jamal's back, wrapping his arms around the fake CEO's waist and lifting him clean off his expensive leather shoes. Jamal let out a startled gasp as he was thrown through the air. He slammed face first onto the brutal ice-covered concrete of the driveway. The impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs, driving his bruised cheekbone hard against the freezing slush. Before Jamal could even attempt to push himself up, the second agent dropped his full body weight onto Jamal's spine, driving a knee sharply between his shoulder blades. The heavy crunch of the tackle silenced Madison's screaming. She froze in absolute terror, watching her charismatic, untouchable husband eat the icy driveway, his arms forcefully yanked behind his back by the federal agents. The sharp, unmistakable click of heavy steel ratcheting shut echoed through the freezing morning air. The federal agent locked the handcuffs tightly around Jamal's wrists, securing his arms firmly behind his back. Jamal squirmed against the icy concrete, letting out a pathetic, breathless whine as the agent hauled him roughly to his knees, then dragged him up to his feet. The custom-tailored dress shirt, which Jamal had worn like a billionaire's armor just hours earlier in my parents' dining room, was now torn, soaked in freezing slush and stained with his own blood. "Jamal Vance!" The lead FBI agent barked, his voice carrying absolute terrifying authority over the howling wind. "You are under arrest for interstate wire fraud, embezzlement, and operating an unregistered securities offering. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The Miranda rights hung in the air, a verbal death sentence to the fraudulent tech empire my family had worshipped. Jamal did not look defiant. He did not look like a visionary CEO plotting his sophisticated legal defense. He looked exactly like a cornered street hustler who had finally run out of runway. He hung his head, his chin resting against his chest, refusing to look at his wife or his father-in-law as the federal agents frog-marched him toward the back of a waiting armored SUV. He offered no resistance as they shoved him into the back seat, the heavy door slamming shut like a vault. Madison stood paralyzed in her soaking wet silk pajamas. The reality of the federal arrest simply could not penetrate the thick, protective bubble of entitlement she had lived inside for 35 years. Her brain fundamentally refused to process the image of her husband being hauled away like a common criminal. She had spent her entire life insulated by wealth, trained to believe that any problem could be solved by swiping a black card or dropping her father's name. She spun around, her bare, freezing feet slipping slightly on the ice. She locked her panicked eyes onto her father, who was still standing on the stone porch, a hollow, broken shell of a patriarch. "Dad, do something!" Madison shrieked, her voice cracking with desperate, unhinged entitlement. She ran toward the porch, her arms flailing wildly, her designer pajamas clinging to her shivering frame. "They are making a mistake. You know the police chief. You play golf with the federal judges. Call your lawyers right now. Tell them to bring the bail money. Jamal cannot go to a federal holding cell. I am pregnant. My baby needs its father. We have a reputation to maintain in this neighborhood. Pay the bail, Dad. Just pay the bail and get him out of that car." She grabbed the lapels of Richard's ruined shirt, shaking him as if she could physically force him back into the role of the all-powerful provider. She expected him to pull out his phone, dial a private fixer, and make the ugly reality disappear with a massive wire transfer. That was how their dynamic had always functioned. Madison created a mess, and Richard buried it under a mountain of cash to protect the family image. Richard stared down at his favorite daughter. He looked at her frantic, tear-streaked face, her ruined luxury sleepwear, and the bloated sense of superiority that he himself had cultivated within her since she was a child. He looked past her shoulder to the driveway where the repo men were currently chaining down the last tires of the Mercedes G-Wagon and the Porsche Cayenne. He heard the massive diesel engines revving, preparing to haul away the last physical symbols of his success. Something deep inside Richard's chest finally violently snapped. The dam holding back decades of enabling pride and financial desperation completely ruptured. With what money? Richard roared, the sheer volume of his voice startling the nearby law enforcement officers. Madison recoiled, dropping her hands from his shirt. She stared at him, her eyes wide with pure shock. Her father had never yelled at her. He had yelled at the staff. He had yelled at my mother. He had spent his entire life screaming at me, but he had never ever raised his voice at his golden child. "Pay the bail," Richard mocked her, his voice dripping with concentrated venom. He stepped off the porch, advancing on Madison, forcing her to back up into the freezing snow. "You want me to call my lawyers? I do not have any lawyers. I do not have a retainer. I do not have a single dollar left to my name. Your brilliant visionary husband stole everything. Do you hear me, Madison? He took my cash, he took my credit, and he took my house to pay off his fraudulent debts." "Dad, stop it!" Madison cried, covering her ears, completely incapable of handling accountability. "You have emergency funds. You have the trust accounts." "There are no trust accounts," Richard bellowed, his face turning an angry mottled purple. "I mortgaged this entire estate to keep your fake, pathetic lifestyle afloat. I took a $4.5 million predatory loan so you could drive that Porsche and pretend you were a billionaire's wife, and Jamal wired every single cent of it to the Cayman Islands to cover his criminal tracks. The federal government just froze whatever pennies were left. We are bankrupt, Madison. We are homeless. We are completely, irreversibly ruined." Patricia, who had managed to crawl her way to the open front doorway, let out a loud, agonizing wail. She collapsed against the doorframe, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands as the absolute reality of their destitution set in. Richard did not stop. The golden child was finally facing the monster she had helped create. "You stood in my dining room tonight and defended him," Richard sneered, pointing a trembling finger right between Madison's eyes. "You slapped your sister across the face for trying to warn us. You begged me to sign away more money to that parasite sitting in the back of the federal cruiser. You are a blind, greedy, arrogant fool. You bankrupted your own family just so you could show off a designer baby stroller to your country club friends.